This is Dennis Graham. I want to give a special shout out to DJ Magic and Outside the Box podcast. Right on, man. Keep doing your thing.
What up, though? It's your boy Big Snoop D-L Double J. Oh my God. Gotta give a shout out to
DJ
Magic's. You can hit him up on his Instagram. It's Magic's the Man at MAGIXTHEMAN.
This is the Outside the Box podcast where we bring on celebrities, we bring on seven-figure earners, we bring on business owners, and today we have a special guest. We have Dr. Amara Pope. She's, at this point, I would say world-renowned for some of her dissertations and also live public speeches. We've seen her grace the TEDx stages, and we've also just seen her online going viral, talking about some very interesting topics as it relates to the music industry. But before we get into that, we're going to go ahead and talk about our sponsor for today. That's Banger App, Bangerr. Banger is an app and a music marketplace for DJs, tastemakers, and artists, where you can come on and you can discover talent, but you can also find the best DJs around the United States that are a part of different networks that can help you get your music discovered in live venues, maybe even possibly the radio. Join the waitlist today at Banger App, Bangerr on Instagram. So for those that don't know, Dr. Pope, can you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what you do?
Yeah, of course. So thank you very much for having me today. Greatly appreciate it. I have completed my Ph.D. in Media Studies at Western University, my Master's in Communication Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, and my Bachelor's Joint Honors degree in Fine Arts and English with a specialization in Digital Media Studies at the University of Waterloo. So I've gone down the academic route. Simultaneously, I've worked very much in the marketing and communications industry. So I have a lot of industry experiences working as a brand coordinator, marketing manager, marketing executive, blog post manager, and a breadth of experiences in the industry as well. So coupling my academic work with my industry experience has really enabled me to understand the world from multiple perspectives. I feel that academia and industry are often very much separated, but I think that when they're aligned and when you have them couple and complement one another, it really brings out great and interesting conversations and discussions. So I am currently employed as a marketing manager, and now that I've completed my PhD, just looking to discuss my dissertation with media and whoever might be interested.
That is awesome. Just kind of getting into that. So the marketing part as it relates to your studies and what you've got your degrees in, is that like, where does that come together with, like, are you a big Drake fan? Let's just say that.
Well, one could say I am a Drake fan and an academic that is interested in what Drake does. I personally grew up in a very small town in Ontario, and I was known as the brown girl with the brown family in the corner house. I grew up in a very small town where we were the only colored, quote-unquote, individuals, and I always felt different. And so music was always an outlet for me to feel understood and feel welcome. So in my Trini household, I've listened to soca music, reggae, R&B, and then in the outside world, you know, I performed, and it performed the more socially accepted version of Amara. And so I always felt like I lived this double life, and I was very much attached to R&B music. As a 90s kid, I also experienced that growth of Canadian R&B, where we saw a mixture of traditional R&B with pop and hip-hop, and finally we got it to hear it on the airwaves on radio. And most of my life, I grew up listening to it just at my parents' house. I never got to see people who looked like me or heard the music I liked in public radio and on television in Canada. So that's why I was really passionate about reinforcing that growth that R&B had in Canadian culture. And I think it represents a lot of our diversity, a lot of the immigrants that we have that contribute to the fabric of Canada. So I'm very passionate about lending myself to that lens and those narratives as well.
Yeah, Canada has been explosive in the last 10 years with music. You know, you got The Weeknd, you have Drake, you have Justin Bieber, among other artists. So just talk about that diversity a little bit and the music's impact of like R&B. Like, you know, how has that lended an influence to, like, you know, cross-culturally American culture and also Canadian music? Like, what are some of like those gems that we haven't heard of coming out of Canada? Like, you know, actually a pre-Drake.
Yeah, well, I do discuss in my PhD dissertation kind of the rise of Canadian R&B. And when I talk about the rise of Canadian R&B, I couple it with Canadian hip hop as well, because I found that many Canadian hip hop and R&B artists were left out of mainstream media in Canada. And that includes artists like Maestro Fresh West, Machine Me, Julie Black, and even going earlier on and looking at our mixed race R&B groups like Crack of Dawn. Crack of Dawn was outselling bands like Earth, Wind and Fire in concert sales and ticket sales, and yet they failed to be supported by mainstream media in Canada. So a lot of these different racialized artists moved to the States, got their support, and then got celebrated in Canada. And this has been extended back to the 1960s. Canada had a flourishing R&B space in Toronto, and yet we failed to support them. Our Canadian government, our Canadian broadcast system. It was pretty sad to see as I dove into that research. So a lot of people came before Drake. We saw artists like Socrates and lots of different people in the generation of Cardinal Official. And they all helped him in little ways, giving him support, giving him and helping him get a network, giving him studio time even to help him start recording his music. And because they grew up in an era without social media, they failed to reach a broader audience. They were very limited. Drake was a newer generation. I call that the second generation of Canadian R&B artists who was influenced by the generations before him, got the networks, but then also got this new taste of social media to help amplify his voice. So I say that there's many generations before him, but I kind of group them all in one because it's the pre-social media era. And so they were really challenged for getting that visibility, but they existed. Canadian R&B, it was a thing here. We celebrated it on the streets and in clubs. There was always performers, but yet we were overshadowed by a lot of American or U.S. Artists who had a larger infrastructure, a larger network, and a stronger presence in the radio space. So it's been there. There was many before Drake.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's kind of what I picked up from just, doing my homework and research on some of your talks. And so there's obviously a societal discourse in the sense of, R&B music and maybe unconscious bias. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so there's somewhat of a societal discourse when it comes to R&B music and its labeling and kind of not getting as much exposure as pop music. And so, can you expound on that a little bit and how that's kind of affected, pre-Drake, how that's affected the exposure of these artists that you say that are unknown?
Yeah, well, definitely. I in my dissertation, I kind of talk about, like I said, an episodic history of Canadian R&B, and I discussed how it took a very long time for Canadian radio and our CRTC, the Canadian broadcast system, to even approve what they called an urban radio station. Essentially, many different styles of music traditionally grouped with Black identities. It took a long time for Canada to approve that, and there was multiple applications. Like I said, Canadian R&B was popular here, but yet it lacked that support. And I go back and talk about the first organized Canadian music magazine. And what we did was we grouped together popular Canadian artists that we wanted to create a star grouping of these celebrities that we wanted to build our music industry through. And yet, despite R&B being popular, blues being popular, hip-hop later being popular, we tended to privilege white rock and white folk artists. So the radio systems, they didn't really support any kind of racialized artists in genres that were coded as Black. And that occurred not only in the radio systems, but also on television as well. The Juno Awards, now they're celebrating even traditional R&B and Canadian R&B, contemporary R&B, but for a long time they didn't even air an R&B or a hip-hop award presented during the actual broadcast. They present them during commercial breaks. So that really was kind of a slap in the face to all these artists who kind of got recognition, but yet only got supported in the shadows. So I think we had a bias of creating a very white Canadian rock and folk national identity. And yet all these immigrants that were working together and even non-immigrants working in R&B and hip-hop were left to kind of fend for themselves. And then you had to run to the U.S. to get support, which is ironic because a lot of the time we talk about Canada being a very inclusive and multicultural space, but we have a shameful history of lacking support for these different racialized identities.
Got it. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And so, with these people being marginalized and boxed into specific categories, we've heard things in the music industry like if it's from a Black artist and they make the music and it's pop, they put it in rhythmic, or in another situation, they kind of codify it to be perceived a specific way, which kind of to some people can be perceived to be inherently racist. Kind of shifting gears, let me ask you this, Dr. Pope. Your dissertation delves into Drake and Justin Bieber's impact on music diversity. And in the midst of these global conflicts we see, like what kind of obligation can the people expect from someone like Drake, who happens to have Jewish heritage, like speaking out? Because, we look at your dissertation and that's like speaking out against these unconscious biases, and that may be like, pseudo racism or racialism, like within these infrastructures. But then you have, and that's what people want to see Drake be able to thrive in, right? And be able to champion that and move forward and move up. But then we see instances where fans are being bombastic on the internet because of Drake's silence in the situation with Israel and Palestine. Like, how do you reconcile that in your perception with your studies? And like, does he owe a responsibility to speak up in the midst of this conflict?
Well, the question of whether celebrities should be participating in these political issues, I think, is very important. I think that their ability to reach larger audiences and allow them to leverage up and garner more attention for critical issues is there. I mean, they should be asserting their or at least highlighting the visibility of some of these important issues, particularly because the artists that I discussed in my dissertation are focused on R&B, and R&B, again, is so heavily steeped in ideologies of race and nationality. And so I think that by participating in these spaces, they should be addressing a lot of these issues that, whether it's a global issue or even, again, in these racial and national conflicts in the organization of music, should be addressing them through their platforms. And I mean, whether or not they have a certain stance or side on it, just amplifying that visibility, I think, is very important. One of the case studies I do mention in my dissertation is Jessie Reyez. And I think Jessie Reyez has definitely used her platform to speak out a lot about different political issues, like Indigenous rights, like Black Lives Matter movement, and even during the Trump election, participating in discussions with immigration. So I think she exemplifies what I really think artists should be doing with their platforms, is discussing these issues. And she self-identifies as having a grandfather that's Black, as having Indigenous roots. And I think all of that is very important, because she's not only, walking the walk, talking the talk as well, and using her platform to really engage in these discussions. So I do think that they should be engaging in these issues and amplifying the visibility of them.
Yeah. And like, speaking on that, another artist out of Canada, obviously we just referenced Justin Bieber, he was caught up in some type of controversy. Yeah. And like, there's irony around that, because his music largely caters to African-American people, but, he's used past racial slurs that were caught on camera, and there was this whole big thing about it in the media, and then it kind of just went away. How do you reconcile that fact that it wasn't canceled, looking at the culture now where there's cancel culture, but his a significant portion of his audience is primarily African American, despite these controversial incidents? Like, how does he hold a bigger responsibility? Do you think people should look in the past and like hold him accountable for like the things he said in the past? And like, do you think it's like disingenuous in how he's creating and producing art for a culture of people that obviously he might feel disconnected with?
Mm-hmm. And one thing I just want to discuss briefly is the fact that these artists are both humans, but as well as marketing tools. And so I find it really interesting when we see artists make mistakes and slip through the ideas or mistakes slip through the cracks, because yes, they're human beings and they can make mistakes, but on the other hand, they have a huge team of people that are helping them create their public image and perform a certain way and say certain things. So I always find it very fascinating when we see these mistakes being made, because it should be going through a long list of people. There should be multiple checks in place to ensure that they're engaging in very respectful ways. So in issues like that, I also think, the racial slurs that Bieber's made in the past, he's had public apologies, of course, but he also highlighted something really important that I think I personally experienced as well, is that in Canada, we didn't learn a lot about Black history in school. And I'm not to say that I'm excusing anything that he had said in terms of racial slurs, but I just found it very interesting because there's a huge ignorance, I think, that happened when I was going through school, for example. I was colored. You know, I'm not Black, but my parents are from Trinidad. My great-grandparents are from India. And I was a colored person. And I've experienced racial slurs like the N-word. And I think it's very interesting to be grouped as othered when you live in Canada and you're a colored person, because there is that lack of education and lack of awareness. So I think in these kind of situations where you see mistakes, it's important to just immediately go towards education and not only educate yourself, publicly apologize, and then educate others on why this issue occurred, what went wrong here, what you're going to do to further educate yourself and inform yourself better.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the biggest thing. And I think that's a huge problem when it comes to cancel culture, is that there is room for growth. Of course, there's also room for responsibility and acceptance of things that you do wrong, but always moving back to that education and finding ways to improve.
Absolutely, you know, and you know, even just playing like devil's advocate a little bit, some people would say that, you know, with the R&B music being codified as Black music, even like some of like if you go at job listings, I seen recently a person was applying for Atlantic Records and they're like head of marketing for Black music, you know, and you know, in those kind of instances, it just kind of like rings hollow. And for a person to say those kind of things, but you know, use a specific genre that's codified to speak to a specific audience, some people would say that's exploitative. Like, do you challenge that, or does he get a pass?
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's super interesting. That's one thing that I just also discussed in my dissertation, is the fact that many, I wouldn't say not necessarily even Black, but many racialized or even non-racialized artists that were Canadian were excluded from the R&B category or faced challenges to enter R&B and hip-hop because they weren't Black Americans. So I think that it definitely works in reverse to also create a form of exclusion as well. And I think that's been going on for a very long time. Maestro Fresh West has talked about it. Nishi Lee has talked about it. Being Canadian, being an immigrant, being from the Caribbean, that's all impacted their abilities to participate in the space.
Absolutely. So in context to your research, how can the music industry learn from artists like Drake and Justin Bieber about like navigating these controversial topics while maintaining a diverse fan base, right? And then especially when faced with these racially sensitive issues, you know, across like how music is codified, how it's branded, you know, do you see like a solution to how, you know, because other artists, even like you look like Tyler, the Creator, he's like come out and said that when winning a Grammy that they would put his music, he specifically made an album that was a certain genre that was not hip hop, but he was still put in a specific category. Like, do you see actionable items for artists to take in order to kind of like take back control, to take back, the integrity in the art, to ensure that they're getting the proper representation?
Yeah, and I think that just comes in dismantling some of the biases that are used to organize music genre categories through race or through ideas of nationality. I discussed in the dissertation the idea that Billboard, for example, in 1949, dropped the use of the word race in organizing music through race music, which essentially meant a Black music genre category. But then they went back and renamed it Rhythm and Blues, and then renamed it Black singles again, and then back to R&B. So it's deeply embedded in just the way we use music genre categories today. And recently, you know, when the Black Lives Matter movement erupted and you know, got reinvigorated in 2020, we saw Republic Records, for example, coming out and changing their use of the word urban, and they said that, you know, they were going to strip it from their verbiage. And yet that was just a prime example that, again, Billboard did that in 1949, discussing the issues of race embedded in music genre categories, and we had that reinvigorated in 2020, and it's still happening. That to me is insanity. So having these music industry organizations and executives really reflect on those embedded issues on race and nationality in the genre categories, I think would be the best way to do this. You have to dismantle the system itself to then allow all these artists to participate more freely. But while I say all of that, I'm also not saying to erase that history, because R&B has such a strong history with Black culture and with many racialized identities trying to push their way into mainstream media and working their way to pave kind of a road for other artists to engage that were colored, that were Black, that were unable to get those resources and that visibility. So while we're trying to reshape these categories, I'm not ever saying erase that history. We need to remember where these ideas came from, but also just make it more accessible to other people.
Got it.
Racial division.
Got it. So definitely you do believe that the industry can leverage some type of intersection between music and social political issues to ultimately find positive change and inclusivity. That is awesome. Okay. Yeah. So for those that want to connect with you and talk with you more about your dissertation and just your ideas and thoughts and like bring you to their stage, can you kind of give us a little bit of information on where we can connect with you and how they can reach out?
Of course. Well, you can follow me on social media on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm at Dr. Amara Pope. That's my handle, Dr. DRAMARAPOPE. Or just visit my website, www.dramarapope.ca. And I'm happy to chat with anyone who wants to discuss any of the issues in my dissertation or any of just these ideas, or just want to express their love for R&B in Canada because I truly do love Canadian R&B music. I think it feeds my soul. So happy to chat with anyone that wants to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, you guys heard it here. Where to contact Dr. Amara Pope. This is DJ Magix, MAGIXTHEMAN, back at you again with some more information, and keep thinking outside the box.